Good evening and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what we do here isn't just read headlines out loud, we dig underneath them. We try to understand the forces quietly reshaping the world before most people even notice something has changed. And tonight, something like that is happening right now in the Middle East. It's not a war. It's not a sudden crisis you'll see flashing across a breaking news ticker. It's quieter than that, and in many ways that makes it more significant. For the better part of a century, Saudi Arabia and the United States have been two of the most tightly bound partners on the global stage. Security, oil, diplomacy, military cooperation, all of it woven together into a relationship that seemed for a long time almost untouchable. But that relationship is changing. Saudi Arabia is talking more with China. It's deepening defense ties with countries like Pakistan. It's coordinating differently with regional players. Old alignments that once felt permanent are becoming more complicated, more conditional, more negotiable. And at the same time, the broader Middle East is shifting around it. Relationships evolving, fractures appearing, dynamics that were stable for decades suddenly becoming fluid. So here's the question we need to sit with tonight. Is Saudi Arabia turning against the United States? And the honest answer, the one that actually holds up when you examine it carefully, is that you're asking the wrong question. Because what's happening here is something more nuanced, more far-reaching, and ultimately more important than a simple story of betrayal or allegiance. What we're watching is a country in the middle of a strategic transformation, a quiet, deliberate, calculated repositioning, not away from one side and toward another, but away from the very idea of being locked into a single side at all. To understand why that matters, we have to start at the beginning. For decades, the Saudi-American relationship was built on a foundation that both sides understood clearly and both sides benefited from. The United States provided security, military protection, a nuclear umbrella, a guarantee that no regional rival could threaten the kingdom without facing serious consequences. Saudi Arabia, in return, contributed to energy stability, helped keep oil markets manageable, and served as a cornerstone of American influence across the entire region. It worked. For a long time, it worked remarkably well. The Cold War helped hold it together. When the world was divided into two opposing blocs, the American-led West versus the Soviet bloc, the logic of alignment was simple. You picked a side. You stayed on that side. Switching was dangerous, expensive, and carried enormous risks. The structure of the global system made loyalty the rational choice. But that system doesn't exist anymore. Not in the same form. The Cold War ended. The world didn't become unipolar forever as some hoped in the 1990s. Instead, it gradually became something messier. Multipolar, contested, distributed. New powers rose. Old powers declined in relative terms. China became an economic giant. Regional powers found more room to maneuver. And crucially, new options became available to countries that previously had very few. Here's the fundamental insight that unlocks everything else in this story. When your options increase, your dependence decreases. When Saudi Arabia had essentially one external security patron and one primary economic partner, alignment was fixed. There was no real choice to make because there was no real alternative. But as the world changed, as China grew, as new financial networks expanded, as technology partnerships became possible across a wider range of relationships, Saudi Arabia's menu of options got longer. And once that happens, once real alternatives exist, the logic of exclusive loyalty starts to erode. Now let's talk about China, because its role in this story is often misunderstood. And that misunderstanding leads to a distorted picture of what's actually happening. China is not entering the Middle East as a military superpower looking to replace American bases with Chinese ones. That's not the model. China is entering through a different door entirely. It's coming in through economics, through infrastructure investment, through long-term energy contracts, through technology partnerships, through financial arrangements that don't come packaged with the political conditions Western partnerships often do. This creates a fundamentally different kind of relationship. It's less about who will protect you in a crisis and more about who you're economically intertwined with over the next 30 years. And for Saudi Arabia, that kind of relationship is genuinely attractive. Not because it offers everything the American relationship offered, but because it offers something different. It offers options. It offers balance. It offers the ability to say to any single partner, we have other relationships and we can use them. That's leverage. And in international politics, leverage is everything. But here's what's critical to understand. This is not a story about Saudi Arabia choosing China over America. That framing is too simple, and it misses the entire point. What Saudi Arabia is doing is making sure that no single relationship defines its entire strategy. It's expanding its network so that every partnership becomes more negotiable, more conditional, and ultimately less binding. In other words, Saudi Arabia isn't leaving the room. It's making sure it has more than one door. Now bring Pakistan into the picture, because this is a piece of the puzzle that often gets overlooked in the broader conversation about Middle Eastern geopolitics. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have had ties for a long time, but those ties are becoming more operationally significant in the current environment. Pakistan offers something specific and valuable: military cooperation, tactical flexibility, and a relationship that operates with fewer of the political and diplomatic constraints that come attached to partnerships with major Western powers. The details of what's happening between Riyadh and Islamabad are often not fully public. Defense cooperation rarely is, but the direction of travel is clear. Saudi Arabia is actively looking to broaden its security relationships, not to replace any single partner, but to build a web of connections that distributes risk and ensures that no single country's decisions can leave Saudi Arabia exposed. Think about what this means strategically. If your entire security architecture depends on one partner, then any shift in that partner's priorities, a new administration, a change in domestic politics, a recalibration of global strategy, can destabilize everything. But if you've built multiple channels of cooperation, the system becomes far more resilient. One channel becomes uncertain, the others hold. The risk is distributed. The vulnerability is reduced. This is not recklessness. This is sophisticated statecraft. Now let's zoom out to the regional level, because this shift doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's interacting with and being shaped by a whole set of other changes happening across the Middle East simultaneously. The region's internal relationships are evolving in ways that make everything more complicated. Countries that once moved in rough coordination are now pursuing increasingly independent strategies. Differences in approach toward major questions, including the question of normalization with Israel, have introduced real divergence. Some states have moved toward new relationships. Others remain deeply cautious. These aren't just diplomatic disagreements. They represent genuine differences in how countries see their long-term interests, and those differences are creating friction within alliances that once appeared solid. Saudi Arabia sits at the center of much of this complexity. It is simultaneously managing its relationship with the United States, navigating its expanding engagement with China, maintaining the specific partnership with Pakistan, handling the divergence with the UAE on certain regional questions, managing domestic expectations about what any of these external relationships mean for the kingdom's future, and keeping a watchful eye on Iran. That's not a list of problems. That's a balancing act of extraordinary ambition. And it requires exactly the kind of strategic flexibility that Saudi Arabia is trying to build. The important thing to notice here is that this balancing act requires flexibility precisely because the pressures are coming from multiple directions at once. If Saudi Arabia were fully committed to one external partner, fully predictable in its alignment, it would lose its ability to navigate between these competing pressures. The flexibility isn't a side effect of the strategy, it is the strategy. And this brings us to what might be the most important concept for understanding everything that's happening here: the difference between alignment and autonomy. For most of its modern history, Saudi Arabia operated within a defined alignment. Its security was structured around the American relationship. Its major strategic decisions were made within that framework. And that framework gave the kingdom something real: stability, protection, a degree of predictability. But it also came with costs. It created expectations. It established boundaries. It meant that certain options were off the table, not because Saudi Arabia chose to exclude them, but because staying inside the alignment required it. Over time, those boundaries started to feel less like protection and more like constraint. What Saudi Arabia is doing now is moving away from that model. Not by breaking it dramatically, but by loosening it, by introducing alternatives at the margins, by building parallel relationships that gradually expand the kingdom's room to maneuver. This is how autonomy develops in international politics. It doesn't usually arrive in a single dramatic moment. It accumulates through small decisions, quiet partnerships, incremental expansions of the option set. And once a country begins to experience that autonomy, it changes how everything else works. It changes how you negotiate with your existing partners because they know you have alternatives. It changes how you respond to pressure because you're not dependent on any single source of support. It changes how you think about risk because the risks are no longer concentrated in one place. Let's think carefully about what this means for the United States, because that's ultimately the question that most observers are focused on. The American position in the Middle East is not collapsing. That's not what's happening here. The United States still has enormous military capability in the region, deep economic relationships, long-standing intelligence partnerships, and a history of cooperation that doesn't disappear overnight. None of that goes to zero because Saudi Arabia is also talking to China, but something real is changing. The American position in the region is becoming less exclusive, less automatic, more dependent on active maintenance, on making the case deal by deal, issue by issue, that alignment with Washington is worth what it costs. That's a significant shift from an era when the relationship largely ran on its own momentum, when shared interest and historical inertia kept everything in place without requiring constant effort. In practical terms, this means American influence in the region has to be worked for in ways it didn't used to be. It has to be competed for, in some sense, against alternatives that now genuinely exist. That's not catastrophic, but it does represent a meaningful change in how power operates. And here's the broader implication of that change. When influence shifts from dominance to competition, the rules of the game change. You can no longer rely on assumptions. You have to earn relationships. You have to manage them actively. You have to offer something, and be prepared to adjust if what you're offering stops being attractive. Now step back even further, because the story of Saudi Arabia's strategic shift is actually a window into something much larger, a transformation in how the global system itself is organized. For decades, international politics had a certain structural clarity. There were dominant powers, defined alliances, predictable hierarchies. Countries knew their place in the system, and deviating from it carried serious costs. That clarity made the world easier to navigate in some ways, but it came with a fundamental trade-off. Countries lower in the hierarchy had limited agency. Their choices were constrained by where the system placed them. That era is over. We are in the early stages of a genuinely multipolar world, a world where power is more distributed, where no single actor can dominate outcomes the way the United States once could, where the rules of the system are still being negotiated rather than handed down from above. In such a world, the most valuable strategic asset isn't military strength or economic size, though both still matter enormously. The most valuable asset is adaptability, the ability to navigate complexity, the capacity to manage relationships across multiple dimensions without getting locked into any single commitment that becomes a trap. Saudi Arabia is building exactly this kind of adaptability, and it's doing it with more sophistication and more deliberate intent than most outside observers give it credit for. But let's not be naive about the risks, because this strategy is not without its dangers. Managing multiple relationships sounds elegant in theory. In practice, it requires extraordinary precision. Partners demand clarity. They want to know where you stand. And when you're deliberately maintaining strategic ambiguity, engaging with competing powers simultaneously, hedging across different alliances, those partners will sometimes push back hard. The United States has already signaled in various ways discomfort with the depth of Saudi-Chinese economic engagement. That tension is real, and it's not going away. There's also the risk of internal contradiction. A multi-aligned strategy works when the different relationships you're managing don't pull in completely opposite directions. But there are issues, particularly around security and military cooperation, where eventually you may be forced to choose. The question is whether Saudi Arabia can keep those moments of forced choice at bay long enough to solidify the strategic flexibility it's building. If the world stays complex and multipolar, it probably can. If some new crisis forces a hard polarization between the major powers, the math gets much more difficult. And there's a third risk that doesn't get discussed enough: the domestic dimension. Saudi Arabia is not just managing external relationships. It's managing an internal audience with its own expectations, its own sense of national identity, its own views on what the kingdom should be doing in the world. Any foreign policy strategy has to stay broadly consistent with domestic legitimacy. Stray too far from what the population and the key internal constituencies expect, and the strategy becomes politically unsustainable regardless of how elegant it looks on paper. And yet, despite these risks, the rewards of getting this right are enormous. A Saudi Arabia that has successfully built genuine strategic flexibility, that can engage with Washington and Beijing, that has reliable defense relationships across multiple partners, that can shape its own regional role without being fully defined by any external power, is a Saudi Arabia with far more control over its own destiny than any version of the kingdom that came before. This matters for the kingdom's long-term ambitions. Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia's sweeping plan to diversify its economy and transform its society, requires massive foreign investment, global partnerships, and sustained stability. None of that is possible if Saudi Arabia is simply a dependent client of any external power. Building autonomy isn't just a geopolitical project, it's an economic necessity. Here's where everything comes together into the clearest possible picture. What Saudi Arabia is doing is not switching sides. It is not betraying an old partner. It is not blindly running into the arms of a new one. What it is doing is something more structurally significant than any of those things. It is redefining the terms on which it participates in the international system, moving from a position of structured dependence to a position of managed interdependence, from fixed alignment to strategic flexibility, from a world where one relationship defines everything to a world where multiple relationships give the kingdom more control over its own fate. This is the real story, not the headlines about a particular deal or a particular diplomatic meeting or a particular defense agreement. The real story is the transformation underneath all of those specific events, the slow, careful, deliberate construction of a new kind of strategic position. And here's the thing that makes this genuinely important beyond just the immediate geopolitics of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is not alone in pursuing this kind of repositioning. Countries across the developing world, across Asia, Africa, Latin America, are watching what's happening and drawing similar conclusions. In a multipolar world, fixed alignment with a single great power is increasingly a liability. The countries that will be most resilient, most prosperous, most genuinely sovereign in the decades ahead are the ones that manage to build flexibility, real, structural, durable flexibility, into the core of their foreign policy. Saudi Arabia is doing that now. It's doing it quietly, gradually, and with a level of strategic sophistication that often gets underestimated by observers who expect big, dramatic moments of rupture rather than slow, structural transformation. So the next time you see a headline about Saudi Arabia making a deal with China, or deepening ties with Pakistan, or taking a position that diverges from Washington's preferences, don't ask the old question, whose side are they on? Ask the new question, what are they building? What kind of position are they trying to construct? What does the finished structure of their strategy look like when all these individual decisions are placed side by side? When you ask it that way, the picture becomes much clearer. Saudi Arabia is not turning away from anyone. It is turning toward a version of itself that has more options, more resilience, and more genuine agency in a world that no longer has the same center it once did. The old rules of global alignment are being rewritten, and countries like Saudi Arabia aren't just watching it happen. They're helping write the new ones. This shift is not finished. It is still unfolding, still developing, still revealing its full shape. And the next phase may well be the most consequential of all. Stay with us because we will be watching every step of it. If this gave you something to think about, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. These are the kinds of stories that matter. Not because they're loud, but because they're structural. And structural changes are the ones that last.